Welcome everyone. Delighted to welcome you to the launch of Déambulations, Keeping the Ground of Our Being, co-curated by myself, Nora Hickey M'Sichili, from the Centre culturel irlandais in Paris, and Brussels-based artist Fiona Hallinan. And this project is a series of 7 audio postcards in the format of walking tours, listened to on headphones from 7 European capitals. And this evening is an opportunity to introduce the format of the audio walking tour and to hear from the artists before the 7 tours are released over 7 Saturdays, one at a time, beginning the day after tomorrow. I can really credit Fiona as having introduced me to the audio walking tour many years ago when she produced a very poetic tour for Cork Midsummer Festival. And I've since commissioned Fiona to create a number of tours. And of course, in these strange times when we walk so much, it seemed a very natural step to approach Fiona about the idea of parallel walking tours in different places. So it's very much a collaborative project with the concept developed by myself and Fiona. And then our 7 invited artists came on board to further develop the idea when we really decided to focus on the local neighbourhoods, despite the fact that we are all living in capital cities. You know, we've all had our movement restricted to 2 or 5 kilometre radius of our homes. So the artists were supported by music producer and musician Brendan Jenkinson, who joins us this evening as well as one of the collaborators. So I'd just like to thank Culture Ireland for funding this project and for their ongoing support of the Centre culturel. And I'm now going to hand over to Fiona Hallinan.
Thank you, Nora. Yes, so as Nora said, my name is Fiona Hallinan and I'm an artist and co-curator for this project. And I'm really delighted to have been asked by Nora and by the Centre culturel irlandais to be involved in this project and to have the opportunity to work with the 7 artists, Rachel Ní Quinn, Fergus O'Concour, Emily Cooper, Gary Farrelly, B. McMahon, Irina Georg and Sunita Appia Korang. So we were so happy with all of the artists that they were able to participate in this project. And what we wanted to do with this evening's event is to launch the 7 audio walks, which will be released every Saturday from this Saturday on the Centre culturel irlandais SoundCloud. And then to also talk a little bit about the kind of process in developing this project, the themes behind it, and the form of audio walks in general, because as Nora said, at this time when sometimes the only means of recreation that so many of us have is a walk, it seems like such a pertinent format. So I started making audio walks in 2005, and it was really the first introduction I had to collaborative practice and to making art in public. And I started making them as a student in Trinity College in Dublin, alongside the musician Cuivine O'Rahillig and the then drama student Maeve Chasty. And we started making the walks out of a kind of desire to subvert the historical campus tours that we saw happening on campus daily. We wanted to create what we called a detour. So we would hand out these mini MP3 players to people that they would be handed out 2 at a time with a kind of synchronized set of instructions on them. So they would send the listeners off in different paths and they would intersect with each other and sort of play with the architecture. So they were really about this idea of bringing our perspective onto the campus, besides the one that was the kind of prominent narrative there. And then also we were responding at that time to the technology available. So the fact that we could afford cheap MP3 players, cheap audio recorders, and we could kind of quickly edit and upload files. But today, that's 16 years ago. And now, you know, or not everybody, of course, but many of us have a far more powerful mobile device in our pocket all of the time. And audio walks and podcasts are so sort of ubiquitous, but I think that there's actually so much more potential and there's such an exciting form. So one of the things that drew me to the form as well as the technology was when I was studying in college. I can remember having one of these really lucky moments when I showed up to a seminar in the National Gallery of Ireland, and I was the only student that had appeared. So I got to have kind of a one-on-one class, and my lecturer took me around the museum and actually showed me how to look at art, or one way to look at art. And it was this really affecting moment, because while I'd been in museums before and I'd been in art contexts and I'd made art myself, I'd never actually been shown by someone how they looked and how you could look in a different way. So it was this kind of attention to detail, and also just a different person's perspective on how you could move around. So the lecturer told me, you know, to stand up really, really close to the painting. You see where there's yellow over here and there's blue over here, and try to see the point where one becomes the other. And it was this kind of way of paying attention I took out into the world with me. And I found that audio walks were a really amazing way to actually then hand that sort of attention over to another person, or to delve into the attention that another person gives to a place. So I remember looking at the world like that as a child, but it had never before that been something that education had offered me or taught me. So that was one of the sort of prompts for Nora and I thinking about audio walks, was to think, you know, it's not necessarily a purely audio form. So the artists in this series come from a lot of different disciplinary backgrounds, dance, sound and audio, but also poetry, writing, visual art. And I think that the audio walk is just a really interesting platform for those forms. It can be intensely visual. It can be very much about movement. And of course, it can be about sound as well. So there's a resource that's been really interesting. And if you are interested in the form of audio walks, I recommend perusing it, called Walking Labs, which is this online resource. They also have a podcast, and they organize events in walking and audio. They speak about sound walks as multi-sensory experiences, and they're really interested in this idea of how they disrupt the kind of centralized position of sight in Euro-Western knowledge frames. So they speak about audio walks as this way to understand places, not just visually, but through sound and smell and sensations and relationships. So they speak about this idea of experiences of walking as not being neutral, never being neutral. And they speak about the world of sound studies, the field of sound studies, as something that needs to be critiqued for its alignment with whiteness and masculinity. So they say, and I quote, "White people position their listening as capable of hearing sound neutrally, and so without prejudice." So they speak about the kind of idea of having counter propositions to this notion of neutrality, of the idea that you can go to a place and have some objective sense of it. And one of the theorists that they cite is the ethnomusicologist Ali Martin. So Martin positions sound walking as a Black feminist method, precisely because of this idea that listening and sound are never neutral. So in Walking Labs, they talk about a project by Martin's where she explores the kind of sonic record of gentrification in Washington, DC. But while doing that, she also makes a audio record of her attempts to keep herself safe as she walks around as a Black woman walking alone. So Martin speaks about this idea of sound walking as non-neutral, and how that amplifies her positionality as a Black woman, which is often perceived, and I quote Martin here, as tainting the neutrality of many forms of knowledge production, while muting the pseudo-objectivity of more passive forms of recording. So she speaks about this as a form that can potentially underline the subjectivity of walking in places, of our sensory experiences, how we each occupy a position and respond to places from that. So as a form that underlines our positionality, and I see sound walking and audio walks also as a form that can allow us to have insight into other people's positionalities and different perspectives, different ways of thinking. So in many cases, the audio walk, and I think in all 7 of these pieces, The audio walk is narrated by the artists themselves, and the listener listens to them on headphones. And this can give this kind of uniquely intimate feeling of being accompanied. And it can even feel sometimes like you're privy to the thoughts of another person, their inner world, while they move about and respond to a place outside. Rebecca Solnit has written a really amazing book on walking called Wanderlust. And she speaks about this idea of the closeness of walking and thinking. So she says, walking allows us to be in our bodies and in the world without being made busy by them. It leaves us free to think without being wholly lost in our thoughts. So she elaborates that the production-oriented culture in which we live leaves little time or platform for simply doing nothing, for simply thinking, and that walking is a good way to disguise thinking as doing something. She says, walking itself is the intentional act closest to the unwilled rhythms of the body, to breathing and the beating of the heart. The thinking that walking can invoke, I believe, comes about from a kind of a dialogue that happens between our inner selves and the places we move through. So the memories that they provoke, and the smells, sound, and feelings there, the hopes or fears that places can engender in us, and the relationships that we have with them, and the human and non-human lives there. So these kind of exchanges contribute to our constructs of identity and place, our ideas of what home is, who we are, where we belong, versus where we find ourselves. And in the case of lots of the artists here, I believe they're, in some cases, in places that are not places they might consider themselves from. So I personally as well, I'm in Brussels, and when I moved here, I definitely didn't think I wouldn't be able to travel back to Ireland for a year. And I think that that's the situation many of us find ourselves in now. The title of the series, The Ground of Our Being, also speaks to that idea, the ground of our being the self that we create that may be connected to a place, but that's in constant dialogue with that. In one of the walks, Rachel Quinn asked the question, how much of our personality and character is forged in the crucible of our geography and social history? I wouldn't have been me if I'd been born anywhere else. So this is a time when we're finding ourselves repeatedly in very limited places that might not be the places we think we ought to be. And I hope these audio walks can offer a small sonic window into someone else's experience of thinking in place. In Solnit's book, in Wanderlust, she quotes Henry David Thoreau, who was a famous walker and theorist of walking. And he speaks about the idea of walking in your locality. And he says, there is in fact a sort of harmony discoverable between the capabilities of the landscape within a circle of 10 miles radius, or the limits of an afternoon walk, and the 70 years and 10 of human life. It will never become quite familiar to you. So there he describes a radius of 10 miles as containing all the discoveries and mysteries of a healthy human life. It's a little bit over the 5 kilometers that you're allowed in Ireland right now to walk. But we're hoping that these walks will be a kind of an excuse or a possibility to journey. And we hope that you will listen, and ideally that you will take them outside with you on a device with headphones and explore your own radius with this perspective on top of it. So to launch the series, we have a compilation of little excerpts from each of the walks to play for you this evening. And I'm going to play that now, and then afterwards, Nora and I will have a discussion, and fortunately, everybody is here, so we can ask some questions. We also have the chat box is there if anybody would like to ask questions about the process. And I'd like to mention as well, this compilation was put together by Brendan William Jenkinson, who Nora mentioned, who sound edited and engineered the series and has been a wonderful technical support to all of the artists in this. So I'll play the compilation, and there's a little sound in between each piece so that you will know when one begins. I'm going to share my screen too so that you can see the order that everything is in. Okay. Nora, would you be able to let me share my screen? Yeah. Oh, great. Thank you. Okay.
Dear listener, it's so nice to talk to you at length. I'm going to take this opportunity to talk to you like I would a friend as we go along this walk. I'm used to having to make everything fit, cutting down a complex thought and eviscerating it until what is left is almost meaningless. But at least it is the correct duration. A listener won't pay attention unless you switch up the voice or texture or something every minute and a half or so. But that's not what we do with friends. We're patient and listen on the phone for hours. Maybe it's the agency. Our power to interrupt allows us to pay attention for longer. Well, I don't want to bore you, but I'd really like to use the time to say something fully. The idea that I can say the same thing in numerous different ways in the hope that some combination of versions means that you can see the things I'm trying to get at. When I'm not clear on what I'm getting at, it's an internal, well, not a debate, but the thing you do when you imagine you're talking to some generalized other inside your head. I guess that process of talking in your mind to figure out what it is that you're thinking.
We're just inside the Copper Mill Lane entrance, and I've climbed to the first reservoir where there's a solitary duck bobbing on the reservoir water. We've had to walk along at least a kilometre of fencing to get in, and all that fencing and the signs here say danger, danger of drowning, keep out, danger of machinery. There are men here with high-vis jackets and hard hats. And it reminds me that making a sanctuary isn't only about openness. Hospitality assumes that the host has property, probably property that has borders or limits. They own resources. And of course, that's what makes it possible for them to offer it to host others.
When planning the reconstruction of the forest of trusses that formed the nave of Notre Dame's roof, many expected modern materials to be used. However, experts have definitively decided that rather than metal or concrete, oak, as used in the original construction, is the strongest, longest lasting and fire resistant material. The trees that made the trusses that held up the roof of Notre Dame for 800 years were mature trees, some already 100 years old. So to rebuild, 1,000 large oaks must be found in France and cut down. The oak forests are gone, as they are at home, used for ships and churches and furniture and never replanted. Oaks are now ornamental, almost sentimental trees, old men lost among the seas of pine, standing lonely in the corner of fields and on the lawns of big houses. I look around at the trees here,
Are the oaks in this garden too precious to cut down? Could consent be given to contribute one oak, or maybe two for Notre Dame?
Public transport access to the Forbidden Zone is via the Botanique metro station. Disembarking passengers file past a vast expanse of hexagon-shaped orange tiles that light up the world, followed by an encroachment of utterly banal grey ones that suck the life out of the space. We move past a monumental bronze disc and twin tower-shaped sculpture that extends a middle finger to passers-by. These confirm that we are headed in the right direction. The main station concourse is deserted, except for a huddled mass of day drinkers hiding from the dirty weather outside. In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the rhythmic drone of the ancient escalators lifts us up and out into the street.
Arena, home of Ajax, great warrior. His mind has been clouded. He knows not what he has done. The analogues, 10th, 11th September, don't let daddy know. Denk aan de zorg, groot respect voor iedereen die in de zorg. Morgen heb je Randstad, morgen kan alles. Randstad, Randstad, Randstad. Wat doe jij morgen? Randstad, Human Ford. For Music Fest 2021, Ziggo Dome, Amsterdam Music Fest, under Rolf Sanchez, Ziggo Dome, Amsterdam, tickets for Krijkvaart. Meer dan ooit zijn we something verbinden. We hebben Vodafone, Ziggo, Giganet, Datacenter, Giganet, Heineken, Coca-Cola, Heineken, Giganet, Ziggo Dome, slappen, strijden tegen COVID-19. Slappen, strijden tegen COVID-19. Ladies, so, dank aan de zorg. Grote respect voor iedereen die verscholen achter een mondkapje laat je horen voor de zorg. Meer dan ooit zijn we verbonden voor al die verbindingen. We hebben Vodafone en Ziggo en Giganet, Datacenter. The analogs, the very best from the studio years, Ziggo Dome, Ticketmaster.nl. The analogs, don't let daddy know. Don't let daddy know. Come on, lights, don't let daddy know. Ziggo Dome. So how much energy is that? 4 facades. It's like 1,000 string of LEDs and maybe 120 bulbs on each string. Say 3 watts each, and that's 120,000 by 360,000 watts. Yeah. Don't let daddy know.
As you progress toward the end of the street, you will come across a small bar, now closed, and a small shop called Späti, where drinks of all kinds and snacks can be purchased. It can be assumed that such places offer the necessary distractions for humans to be able to deal with the above-mentioned economic condition, although not much trace of it could be observed during my stay. If you turn left once you reach the main road, it will be easy to keep track of the route, as an elevated train line marks the middle of the street. Every 4 minutes, yellow trains pass in both directions, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes not. While enjoying some technological advancements, which seem to make their everyday life more bearable, such as the use of mechanized trains, humans are still behind in terms of the established technical requirements of the Cosmic Union. And as a result, I would strongly recommend that contact is withheld for the time being.
The absence of the soul remains a carcass of dense bones, graying shapes of infrastructure alluding to its filling, its feeling, its fullness, its current, the ever-flowing and stated pulse. Sweet bitter memories and suggestions of hearts and minds you lured here, all waiting for the faintest song, jibe, or poem, for a sign of your return. To a moment familiar, to the push-pull discourse summarized in your pet name, contradiction of fairness and city, a tug of war between legacy and the transience of modernity. And amidst masked thoughts, safe distanced walks, and ever-continued uncertainty is the stillness of the people, and the burning question and answer. In circumstance peculiar, what makes this place feel worthier of hanging on to and hanging in there? Until its river waters settle. Is it its history? Is it its future? Is it its spirit? Is it its humor?
Wonderful. That's it's wonderful to have that overview of all of the audio walking tours, and I'm sure it was interesting for you all, since you have only heard your own piece. So I'm sure it was interesting to hear the different perspectives and different kind of routes taken by the others. And since we released the walking tour made in Scotstoun, Glasgow this Saturday, I thought I'd begin with a question for you, Rachel. So artist and composer Rachel Ní Quinn. One of the things that struck me about your piece was the idea, you use the word mystery, and that when we go for a walk, when we open our front door and step outside, we're in a sense embarking on a mystery every time, and we don't question that. You know, we don't feel we have to understand everything. And you kind of, I felt, gave me license to not understand everything, and that was okay. And I really like that, because we don't expect to understand everything. You know, we hear snippets of conversations as we walk. We kind of see half pictures in windows. And I just thought, and we've also other thoughts going on in our heads. So that kind of stream of consciousness that you shared with us as well. And the word mystery, really, that struck me. Whether you'd like to say something about that, and obviously the whole process for you.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. I just really loved working on this project. It just chimed with lots of different things I've been thinking about for a long time. And I do produce radio and sound and music in all sorts of different forms. So this was kind of novel to be doing something that was directly like radio, but didn't have the same kind of constrictions. So it was really a breath of fresh air to create something without certain parameters in place. So for me, it was interesting because we just moved to Scotstoun and it was a new neighborhood for me. And it was also one of the first times I'd actually been able to go out for a walk on my own. Just having a then 2-year-old, who's incredibly independent. I wasn't getting out much on my own at all. So it was really very much, it coincided with the time where I was able to go for a walk by myself in a new place. And I guess it was going back to that moment of like before I became a parent, just re-engaging with that thought process of having space in my own brain to think about what I wanted to think about. And going around a new place, and Glasgow has an industrial history, and where we are is kind of like, people who are familiar with Dublin, it's kind of like the East Wall of Dublin, where there's the shipping industry and there's warehouses and factories, and it's something I could never understand. Some people think that warehouses and factories and kind of industrial landscape is unattractive. It's something that I've always been really attracted to, and just I really want to be able to get inside those buildings and see what's there, and especially when they're empty. Like, no, not so interested in, seeing what actually takes place in them, but just wanting to be in those spaces and see what they're like. And so when you're walking around a city, you kind of have to just accept the fact that you won't know what's inside those spaces. And the odd time you might get to see inside some of them, but you're never going to see inside all of the ones that you walk past every day. And I think that just the stream of consciousness thing, in terms of how I approached it, was just very much an intuitive approach, and very much how I do think, in terms of flipping from one thought to another thought. And so I loosely based it around a very specific journey that I do, and I try to keep it in real time to that journey. But I actually combined many different journeys and many different thoughts that I had on journeys like that. So the stream of consciousness thing, I think, is something that is one of the delights of being able to go for a walk on your own and just engage with your own brain in that way.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. I think I'm going to hand over to you, Fiona, because we're going to maybe manage to speak to everybody first before we open up.
Yeah, we just thought we'd go through and ask sort of everyone a question at the same order that we listened to you all. So Fergus, you're next. Yes, thank you so much. It was so beautiful, and I've had the chance to listen to your whole piece. I wanted to talk to you about something that you mentioned in that excerpt. You talk about the idea of hosting and the host having something to offer, essentially having a bounded space. And then in your walk, you also talked about coming to London when you moved there. But yeah, I would love to hear you talk, maybe if there's kind of a correlation to you between movement and dance and these ideas of boundaries.
It's really interesting because I was just listening to Rachel talk maybe about and Nora about mystery, and I think what it prompted in my head, and my initial thought was, oh gosh, I knew where I was going. It felt important to me. To kind of share with people a territory and an environment that I knew well, that I had spent in 2018. I'd spent 6 months as artist in residence in these Walthamstow wetlands. So I really felt it was in my body, and maybe that's because I don't feel that the other environments around me are in my body. But I realized that one of the reasons that it's important for me to kind of know and to have that sense of territory or ground is because that's what makes it possible for me then to be surprised, to be open to the unexpected. So there's something about in my case, wanting to build a structure that then allows surprise. And maybe that's what relates to the thing about boundaries and hospitality. You know, it's, people will know that the word for hospitality is also related to hostes, which is the enemy. So there is a kind of negativity in terms of that the host has power, they have territory, and they can't share it. And in fact, if someone comes and takes that territory, then it's no longer hospitality, it's something else. So there is that like tension in hospitality and in the idea of sanctuary. And I'm really aware on the wetlands, it's a man-made space. It's constructed a set of reservoirs, which, because they were closed reservoirs, became a space of sanctuary for wildlife. And then not just for wildlife, but for solitary anglers and birders, and now for people walking there. So there is this like this human, quite like lots of signage, as I said in the piece, danger, high-vis hats, all of that sort of stuff. And yet that kind of clarity around the boundary is what allows these wonderful, magical space of openness and possibility. And I think for me in the audio walk, what was really the invitation, because, you know, I'm not someone who works with sound in that way, was to try and think how this could be a choreography, how it could be a dance. At a time when I'm not able to dance with other bodies, how could this wonderful opportunity that you guys have given to be commissioned to connect with people, how could I maybe choreograph the inner landscape of people who will be listening? Because choreography isn't just about changing the shapes of people's bodies on the outside, it's also about changing the tonus, the tensions, the ideas that are passing inside us. So I loved this opportunity to be able to do that. And I'm actually really curious to see whether it's something that I can continue.
That's great. There was a really musical element to yours as well. I have to ask about that, because I didn't know that you made music as well.
So the music isn't mine. The music comes from Irlo Leonard, a piece of music that he gave me actually when I was working on the wetlands, and so used deliberately because of that connection. It's actually an instrumental piece that he's used in other situations when he's singing. And it's interesting because I guess I come from the countryside in Ireland. I think my creativity is born of being a child playing in the fields. I know that. I know when I'm making work that's where I try to be. And something about the wetlands is a space of connecting. Irla comes from a Gaeltacht like me. I recognize in his voice and in his singing something, it's a different Gaeltacht, but something about the world I grew up in. So I think his work has often been a key for me, kind of like my own secret passageway back to that source. I often say when I'm meeting potential collaborators, I'm looking to see whether they have a green space in them, and like their own little playhouse or their own little world. And I'm sort of trying to figure out, do you have one of those and could we play together? So I think it's interesting, yeah, that you spotted that piece of music, because I think for me, like, it's a beautiful piece of music, but for me, it's also doing something in terms of linking me back, not just to the wetlands, but actually to my home in Ring.
Great. I think I might start asking people if they have a wetland in them.
It's a beautiful place.
Yeah. Thank you.
From the poetry of that, I love the idea of you, Fergus, as a child of the fields. And if I move now to Emily Cooper, poet, and Emily, you obviously made your piece in Paris while you were on a residency in the Centre Culturel Irlandais. And I suppose I was curious as to your approach as a poet your work is very descriptive. There are layers of observation, and just how you approached the making of this as a poet and somebody who hadn't worked with this medium either before.
Yeah, I think that was the greatest challenge, was knowing that I didn't know what I didn't know going into this. So it was quite interesting, and also because I was in Paris for a while, but that time was quite limited, so I couldn't come back to the place over and over. So what I decided to do to sort of react to that is I made a lot of field recordings when I was there, and then made notes. And then when I got back home, I wrote a very long poem. I think it's actually the longest poem I've ever written, because it's quite unusual to try and fill that amount of time with poetry. So it ended up being 7 pages long, which is much, much longer than anything I would usually write. And it also gave me like a lot of space to explore all the different ideas I had. And so I came home, I wrote and I recorded it, and I combined it with different sounds that matched up with the idea when I was in Paris.
Excellent. And just I suppose one of the things that struck me as well was at the beginning, the idea of you standing in front of Gertrude Stein's house and your concern not to be perceived as a tourist, as an outsider.
I think that was like one of the main jumping off points for me, because when I was in Paris, it was a really strange time. The lockdown was starting again, and it had kind of felt like it was nearly over. So it was like this weird feeling of I wasn't really supposed to be there at that time. And I think that's like on top of that feeling of being in a city that's not your own was quite disarming. And that's kind of how I ended up in the Jardin de Luxembourg so often, was because I felt like it was almost like a safe space for me to sit in, and like a communal space. But it made me think about the space itself, like what is the nature of a park, and it's so unnatural in a lot of ways, but it sort of has almost the feeling of nature, which is quite relaxing or makes you feel at home, but at the same time it's an extremely contrived space in the middle of Paris. And I also thought a lot about like who's allowed in those spaces, like who's allowed to feel safe in those spaces, and that they have the appearance of being open to everyone, but at the same time they're not. Like, they're guards and there are restrictions within them.
And I remember you got a bit of a shock at the end when because the guards always go around fermeture. It's very, it's a very particular moment in the Luxembourg Gardens, and I enjoyed that. You were both a little taken aback. Okay, thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Okay, so Gary, thank you so much. Yours is the only walk I've actually been on, which was a great pleasure. And I got a guided tour by you. That's my full disclosure. But it's so brilliant, your walk. And I think in the excerpt we heard a little bit of this, like, what I think is really interesting is you're describing a walk around this area called the Cité Administrative, and it's a kind of a constructed bureaucratic center of Brussels. But there's this like latent kind of theatricality in all the things you describe, like even when you describe the tiles in that little part, that every little detail has this like potential to kind of become something else. And it really made me look at that space like, the government are trying to make this like very serious space for very serious government issues, but like it's just forced seriousness, and you can't really cement over like the human farce of it. And even when we were there, the space had, well, maybe you could talk about actually what we saw when we were there. And if you could talk about this kind of theatricality of spaces. I'm not sure if we can hear you actually. Oh yeah, we can't hear you now. No, you're not muted. Would you like us to come back in a moment, Gary? We'll move on and then come back to you in a sec. If you can do a little test. If we're stuck, you can type. Oh, muted by the host. No, you're not muted. No. Gary, maybe we come back to you in a moment, but you could type and I could read an answer if you like. Come back to me. Okay, we'll come back. So I'll speak to B next. Great. So B, thank you so much. That was really, really wonderful, and I loved it. I'd love to talk to you about a piece, about one particular aspect amongst many, but there's, in this excerpt that we played there, there's this wonderful kind of musicality to how you speak, and I imagined what you were kind of doing was reading signs of the city, and it started to almost like paint this image to me of like a palimpsest of billboards being torn off. But yeah, I'd love to hear about like how you worked on it, how you related to, because I know that you make music as well, how you related to songwriting. Yeah, this form. Oh, you're muted too. You're actually muted. Oh, you're there now.
Oh,
yes, I can hear you.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so that actual clip you played is from, I was reading the Ziggo Dome, and the Ziggo Dome is the theatre very near my house, but it's actually 4 walls of LEDs. You can see it for miles. It's so bright, and it's playing like LED screens of advertising, and then it links into kind of the industrial area where all of the, what would you say? Yeah, all the warehousey kind of like B&Q type places are, test car showrooms, etc., etc. But it's really on this kind of motor highway. But I guess, yeah, it's a funny area because it's like a palimpsest of many designs and many different kind of economic and different things that have happened, and to move through it, because it was designed as utopia, and then the government changed and they didn't complete utopia. So it's sort of, it is utopia, but it's very difficult to navigate. So you can only sing it, I guess. And it's very noisy where I live. There's a lot like of, what would you say? Like the aggressivity of the capitalist world is here. I think Holland invented capitalism or financialization. They did stock marketing first, etc., etc. And this is like, you just feel this, but then it's, on the other hand, when you're in it and when you're in a utopia of this, it's sort of, it does become a song and in other terms. And that was for me doing these walks with, because I had intended, if I go the other way, I go to the forest, and I thought I'd be more a nature girl. I have an inner wetland, I do. But I actually, no, I ended up on the motorway going like beside all this kind of roar, going, wow, it's really, yeah. And then how you are with your body and negotiating these signs that you're reading. So much of it, like much of what we're given is signs of the city, the pavement where the pavement ends, where many designs have not met each other, and you cross spaces that you're not really allowed through, or you are allowed through. And yeah, for me, how to wander and not follow the design paths is super interesting here, because I find in Dublin, it's something I noticed more after moving here, that there's a lot of grey stone walls, and your path is blocked everywhere, and maybe because of the British being there, or maybe because of the church being there, but for many different reasons, there's a lot of institutions with high stone walls. So to occupy the city, you're often blocked. And here, maybe because of, I don't know, Mondrian or someone, that there's an enveloping feel that you suddenly emerge into these zones that are completely strange again. And yeah, so you can go on forever, and you just have to keep spinning, I guess.
Yeah, it was really, like, I found it really, really strangely visual, like your sounds, I really could see it. And it felt like how sometimes you can feel barraged by words when you move around in the city, and you kind of start to forget how affecting that is. I've noticed since I moved to a non-English speaking country that I'm kind of a bit like, it's a bit dulled down for me, which is kind of a relief. Like, I'm kind of blissfully unaware of like magazine covers and advertisements, and they're just kind of slightly blurred over. But yeah, you really captured that kind of like the patterns and words that you encounter.
Yeah, and how you're led through something that, like, so if you start naming them, it's just try and find what you're being told all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing I was curious with these walks, because I mean, at the beginning, it was an easy thing, but it was a difficult thing, because you just set off and start walking with a recorder. On the other hand, I was curious about the voice, and maybe I ended up more towards a song-like voice, which is just the voice in your head, rather than addressing an imaginary listener, because I didn't know who these listeners could be, and I couldn't fathom them. So I was talking to the audience that lives inside me. So then, yeah, it was a bit, and that was a curious. I was going, where is this voice, or how to position it? I find that very strange, like where to put that. So that ended up being, just a being reading the signs and negotiating signs. So I got rid of myself and the audience.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would we try Gary again? Can we just check your sound? Dear.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
You're unmuted apparently as well, so I think it's an issue with your sound, Gary. I'm sorry, we can try again if there's any way of checking it. But in the meantime, can I ask Irina? Irina, you, while Emily was concerned about being perceived as an outsider, and even Rachel, I remember, mentioned that her daughter would have a Glaswegian accent. That was something that, while you are not of the place, you kind of, there was that that idea that your daughter is somehow of the place, which makes it, again, there was some kind of concern about being the outsider, not of that place. But Irina, you took a particular position on this, and you embraced that role of the outsider. So I was just wondering why you did that. It obviously changed your relationship with the place. Then it was an interesting point de départ. I'm interested to hear more about that.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for initiating this. It's been a great experience, and especially doing this in lockdown when everything was shut, and particularly in Berlin, everything was really closed. Other than supermarkets, nothing was open. So it was a very, very specific time to be doing something like this. So for me, it was really a combination between the atmosphere around and we also had a real winter, so what was happening around, and this idea that I'd been working with before. So I started from something which is from this ground of interest, which I followed in other work, like this idea of the alien, you know, and the alien perspective. And I use that in a performance, for example, which creates a different type of experience when the audience is in front of you. But doing it on an audio walk created something else. And I was really interested in testing what happens if you try to look at the places around as if you were completely foreign, not only a foreigner from another country, but also a foreign visitor from another planet, maybe. How does the significance of places change, and how do things which for us are very familiar become really strange? How do objects lose their purpose? So I tried to test that in my neighborhood, which created an interesting experience for me, because I'd go out on these walks, and of course there were things I knew, and there were things which were familiar for personal reasons, but also places of historical significance, if you want, like, I don't know, iconic buildings like the planetarium or a particular cinema or a particular statue, but also places which didn't have any significance whatsoever. So then I was just constantly trying to see what happens if I take on this other perspective. What would it be like? What message could you get from these places? So I guess it was a bit of, I used a bit what B was describing in relation to the signs, because always if you go to a place and you don't know anything about it, you always have some signs around. You have words which tell you what the place is or how it's called, and then use that kind of language to push it more. But yeah, so that's where it started from me. But it was really nice to do it actually in the neighborhood where I live. So mix this really alien perspective with this very, very familiar perspective, but in an unusual time as well.
I enjoyed your very specific directions too, that, you know, we were somehow going in the same direction, even if we weren't on the same path. There was something kind of unifying about that, which I enjoyed.
Did you listen to it outside or inside?
I did. No, I was walking. Yes, yeah. Okay.
So I will ask Sunita. So Sunita, thank you so much. I really loved your piece, and it was such an amazing, like, amount of different forms. You know, like the music that we heard at the beginning, and then it kind of goes into poetry, and then you also use these recordings from political debates. I was really curious about your connecting of the content to the place, the site of Herbert's Park and the Dodder Pitch, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and why you chose there.
Sure. Yeah, so thank you so much for asking me to do this. And yeah, I really kind of it gave me like a really great opportunity to connect with my environment in a way that I don't think I would have otherwise had a chance to. I moved to Herbert Park kind of area, Ballsbridge, Herbert Park area, just in around the time that we were like embarking on this audio journey. And I'm relatively new to Dublin as well. Grew up mainly in Kerry and in Cork and in the countryside. So it really, in one sense, I felt like I was ill-placed to take this exploration because I felt like I wasn't really representative of Dublin. But then on the other, I had kind of fresh ears and eyes to analyze the place. And I guess the beginning, which was kind of, I guess, poetry or spoken word, was kind of posing a question as to what's the essence of a city or a neighborhood. Kind of considering as to like my journeys to other cities and especially in light of COVID, like what is the essence of a place when the people are gone from it, and kind of alluded to like infrastructure and buildings that really kind of, signify or indicators as to where you are. And I felt like it was a very interesting time to be living around Harbour Park and Ballsbridge, because it's a very transient place at the moment, in the sense of there's the park and, you know, the loveliness of that, but then, you know, there's a huge amount of infrastructural change happening in our locality. There's buildings that kind of hint at the legacy of the place. So all these questions were kind of surfacing in my mind as to the identity of a place. You know, what are the indicators of what Dublin is? Literally just around the corner from me, there's a pub that, you know, it's very kind of old-timely and has loads of, I actually can't remember the name of it, but there's a snippet, there's a recording of a reading of a newspaper, basically saying that the pub is going to be knocked down and made into a student accommodation. So I guess for me, in doing these walks around Harbour Park and kind of down to Grand Canal and circling that kind of area where there's this huge amount of infrastructural change and you know, and tech, you know, businesses and buildings coming up, was the question of identity, the legacy of Dublin. And then I guess in terms of the snippets that I chose to also embed in the piece, the political statements, it was particularly interesting to walk around Dublin over the summer because there were loads of protests happening in regards to Black Lives Matter, in regards COVID and, you know, wearing masks, and yeah, just a lot of like discourse and friction that I happened to, you know, fall upon. So in capturing all of that, there was a lot of questions as to the transience of the city, whether people like it or not. And somewhere in that, my interaction with all of that as a person that doesn't really belong to the, you know, the kind of the type of demographic or person that you would expect to be walking and living around Harbour Park and interacting with it all. So yeah, it was a mishmash of loads of different things, but it felt like it was appropriate at the same time.
Yeah, it was I kind of, I wondered about it, if it was something like a particular building that had prompted, because I think one of the debates was about the mother and baby homes, and the destruction of the archive, and I wondered if maybe is there a specific building, but then at the same time, that kind of, it's a little bit like with B and the signs, like at that time that you were making the walk, that like social history was so loud and so present.
Yeah,
being in
yeah, absolutely. And I guess the relevance of that, I suppose, was, you know, so I would kind of find myself walking towards, like, you know, down Leeson Street and Marion Square and kind of down by the Dáil, and then, you know, around by the Grand Canal and back towards Harbour Park. And again, like coming back to the Dáil, it kind of was like like a pillar that I kept coming back to, because there were protests happening from Ballsbridge, US Embassy down towards the Dáil and around there. And then similarly, I was walking through town one of the days, and again, people were stationed at the Dáil. And so there was this outward, you know, noise being made about like social injustices and things that people care about outside. And I suppose in terms of the recorded pieces, I was trying to kind of, yeah, capture as to like what the internal conversations on the other side of the wall were, and how, you know, how they were tying into what it is that people are kind of calling into question. Yeah, so I guess like the overarching question initially is kind of just, you know, looking at like, you know, what is this place? What is the essence of Dublin? Like, how, you know, how do we capture the sounds? And the sounds were just very, there's a lot of discord as well as piece. So there's like that birdsong kind of vocal a cappella piece that I was, that I came up with. And it was just this juxtaposition between the two that I found great moments of peace and solitude. And I felt like I was in the countryside in different moments, but then the realness of the place and kind of a lot of the disgruntlement as well of people around me also was just really interesting to kind of dip in and out of. So yeah.
Yeah, it was beautiful. And I love that it starts with a question.
Yeah, it started with a question. I don't know if there was ever an answer, but yeah, it was a fun one to at least kind of mull over. Yeah.
Thank you. So Gary's back. Oh, we can't hear you. I'm so sorry, Gary. I'm almost tempted to phone you. I think the best thing might be, Gary, if it's not too painful, if you could type a little.
I would suggest maybe that, yes, if Gary wanted to contribute with a few words, and maybe we could ask if Brendan wants to say a few words just about the whole process before we open up. We've a great question from Aideen Barry, so I'm keen to get to that and conscious that we don't have too much time left. But Brendan, thanks so much for your work as a collaborator on this.
And you're muted, Brendan.
Oh, hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry. Thanks so much for having me on the panel. And it was a great experience for me doing this project, because I got to hear everyone's work before anyone else, I think. So that put me in a very privileged position. I have a little studio just up the road. I live on North Circular Road in Dublin, and I have a little studio, and it's like a 2-minute walk up the road. So for like the 2 weeks or so that I was working on these, I would walk up to the studio, and then once I was in there, it was like then the walks would really start, and just this imaginative journeys I was going on, like this sort of vicarious sense of traveling. It was perfect for being in a 5K limit. And yeah, like in terms of my role, I just wanted to sort of offer a little bit of support and a little bit of my own expertise to anyone who didn't have experience with audio. And yeah, I tried not to get in the way too much, because everything I heard was great. It was so amazing, so imaginative and beautiful writing. The writing was so beautiful. So yeah, just tried to sort of embellish things a little bit, and just to sort of maybe just general levels of things, and just trying to get it, you know, to sound as good as possible across a variety of systems. And the other thing I was just thinking about was like how something that's kind of come up from this project is like how sort of accessible it is for a lot of people to actually make audio walks of their own. Because I know like a lot of some of the artists hadn't worked with audio before, and I think like the results are pretty great with like basic equipment, with just using a phone as a microphone and as a recorder. And it's kind of amazing what you can do with those few limitations. So I think that's kind of a really interesting outcome of this, and that, you know, lots of people could put together audio walks. But yeah, just like thanks so much for having me, and yeah.
That's a great point, Brendan. DIY will be having, you know, we'll be inundated now with audio walks. It's a good point. Thanks.
Thank you. I might just try a little experiment. I have Gary on the phone. Will we try? Can you hear me, Gary?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, can you hear that?
I can't hear anything now, but he's not talking.
Okay. Okay, you can go ahead. Speak to us.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Wow, this is kind of like early, yeah, as I said earlier, it's a little bit like early Eurovision technology in the 1980s, you know. They would call in to get the points from Belgrade or something. Yeah, can you repeat a question so that I could kind of respond to it? Because
oh yes, I don't think my question merits this. So I spoke, I suppose, a little bit about the idea. You talk about this place, the Cité Administrative, which is this kind of constructed bureaucratic centre of Brussels, and the idea is that historically, well, in recent history, this was built as a way to join the governments of the Flemish and the Wallonian leaders.
It's a super political space, and it's part of a very masculinized form of political way of organizing cities, and it's it's one of those strange moments where political machinations become expressed in architecture. But in fact, when I arrived in Brussels, I was living just across from this zone. I always call it a zone. It was never a. It was always something kind of dead and stagnant. It was a zone, over the time that I was living in the city, a lot of chapters of my life got played out through that space in the city. Showing, I always would show people around when they would come and visit the town. It was always kind of a space where I found a certain license to be really performative. So when you asked me to make a walking tour of a neighborhood in Brussels, I saw this as a really exciting opportunity to kind of try and gather some of this really explicitly dusty, oppressive, administrative history and kind of link it with my own kind of slightly unhinged and permissive experience and fictionalizing and self-narrativizing around the space, which myself and Fiona experienced in real time, both prior to and when the talk was actually delivered to her. When I was kind of thinking about where to do a talk in Brussels, myself and Fiona, I brought her to the Forbidden Zone, which is what I call the space. I never call it the administrative city, never have, never will. It's the Forbidden Zone. We went there and we drank a strong beer there. And in the middle of the space, there's a sort of grassy knoll, a wild enclave, a very sealed off, hermetic space in the middle of this very controlled zone. There's a sort of wild enclave, and we went and we started drinking in there, and all of a sudden something started, shaking, and there was some sort of like wild element that we didn't know whether it was a mammal or we didn't know whether it was a rat or whether it was a kind of a predatory person, but it was enough to make us flee the scene. It was kind of a strange thing, and it made me decide that yes, this must be the site where I'm going to make my tour. And then, in fact, I kind of leaned quite heavily on the idea of that wild enclave. And then we went back afterwards to kind of re-walk through the tour. And that space in the center of Brussels, which is totally controlled, a totally mechanized, controlled, bureaucratized space. And that maybe 80 meters squared was one of the most wild enclaves in the city. And in the time, and it had probably been there for 20 years, and in the time since I had made my tour, which was 2 weeks, some sort of machine had come in and completely sliced down the space where we had had that experience. It was really a strange thing. Really emotionally gutting, actually, for both of us. It was like, I can't really put it into words. It was quite horrible.
Yeah, it was horrific. But the walk now becomes like a record of that place somehow.
I can't help but thinking that the walk somehow invited that thing to happen.
Yeah, we publicized it. Gary, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry for the technological glitches.
Thank you. We have. I'm sorry to do that so fast, but we got a lovely question in the panel chat box, and we should ask it, and then I think we should finish up so that people can return to their evenings. So I'll read the question from Aideen Barry. The Swiss writer and famous flaneur Robert Walser said, "I don't want a future, I want a present. You have a future only when you have no present, and when you have a present, you forget to even think about the future." So my question to the artists involved is that notion of being present when making this work and kind of letting the work manifest in that time, allowing things to have their own true course and trusting in the process of being present right there and now led to the making of these host-like works.
Thanks, Aideen, for that great question. I think Fergus had wanted to respond.
I'd like to bring up the other question as well, which is in the Q&A from Brian Ferguson Connor, that says, thank you for this wonderful introduction to the series. Despite all the déambulations, there is a leitmotif in all of the pieces of back home, back to the roots and origins. Would anyone like to comment? And when I heard both of the questions, and also a little bit B talking about who we were addressing, if we were addressing anyone, if we were present, it made me think that presence is also being present with what's absent, with what one remembers, and it's much more a kind of porous presence. So yes, I think, as we talked about before, I think home is present for me when I'm on the wetlands, even though it's geographically a very different place. But I feel like that homeness is something I'm inviting, or I'm remembering, or I'm connecting to. And in a way, those sort of layers of what's there and what's not there are part of the being there. We see the world around us, we experience it, we feel it, also with this archive of other experiences that we're bringing in our bodies and our memories to that environment. And I really, with sort of thinking about B, I know for me, I was thinking about both the person I might be addressing while I was there recording, but also thinking about whoever they were with me in the place where they would be listening. So in a way, I would be displaced in this other environment that I even had no idea about. And it also made, while I'm on the wetlands, I really think about being filled with the non-human life around me, or the infrastructure. And I guess one of the ways that came out in the audio walk is finding myself shifting pronouns to be sometimes addressing me, sometimes addressing you, sometimes to be we, so that it's yeah, it was interesting, that experience of this audio walk being in someone's ear, in their head, but not knowing who they were, and that ghost unknown being in me now, but me also being a ghost in them, sometimes speculatively in the future. So that's what those two questions made me think about.
Great.
Does anybody else want to step in? Emily?
I think for me, it's quite interesting, that idea of the present, because my piece was kind of geographically disjointed from itself. And I think that gave me the opportunity to open it up much more. So I sort of reached back into the past a lot further than I think I would have if I had been in that spot for the whole time of the making of the piece. And it kind of made me consider like a much longer timeline of the space and the environment of it, and the trees, and also a lot of preoccupations that I have at home. So I think it was like, it's quite interesting how present all the rest of the pieces seem to me in the clips that I've heard. Like, they're really embedded within the moment of the recording, and I think mine is like slightly different to that, but maybe it works, I don't know. But I think the idea of present is really important in it as well.
Could I ask a question of the other artists? How many of you recorded your narration in the site where you were walking?
Sorry, Rachel.
It was just something that I had really queried myself whether I should or shouldn't do, and I ended up not doing it. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to hearing how everyone else approached it in their full pieces.
I have a very silly question, which is just bird song. The birds were wonderful. I mean, were they real? Or Brendan, were you responsible for the wonderful bird song? genuine recordings? Yeah, wow, impressive.
Can I just say something about what Fiona said earlier in terms of being out of your own language? And so there's a sort of like, it softens the chatter of the information that comes in, but there's something else very strange happens. Like sometimes I think I'm like a pink sausage lying in a field and then everything's flowing by. But you're also, what would you say? You're carried through this other medium in a very strange way, that where language is, when you're not entirely familiar, it's quite a thing rather than being invisible. So I find that quite, and so sign reading and language reading becomes this, and that goes back to the question on, that someone put in the Q&A about back home. So back home is often a place of invisibility where you can't see these things until you leave. So I couldn't see the walls in Dublin until I left and came here, where it's sort of straight view, also very, very flat land. So these peculiar landscapes bring these things to view. So you can see back home clear from far sometimes, I don't know.
I used to always call Pebble Dash my memory wallpaper. Because it's just like that texture that was just always there when I was growing up, and now it's not there anymore, and I noticed something else is starting to take it over.
Mm-hmm. Pebble Dash.
I think you will have plenty of questions for each other once you've listened to the walks. And it was wonderful that, you know, if we go back a few months, that we were able to meet as a group. We almost, I feel like we created a little community, even though you worked individually on the pieces with support from Brendan. But, you know, I do feel we are like a little community, and once you've listened as well. And what's really beautiful about the walks, of course, is that, you know, we enter your heads, like we are your invisible companions, your friends. And that's beautiful. That's really, I think, in these times as well, you know, where people are walking, and when they listen to the tours, that in a sense it's a comfort. It's you know, I think people have really responded to this idea of the audio walking tour, particularly in different places. You know, the number of people who said, oh, I can't wait to go to Paris, you know, with Emily Cooper, or wherever, you know, wherever the other various cities as well. And so they'll have that chance to travel in a sense through you when we're so confined. But I would like to end by thanking you all, thanking you, the artists, Fiona, Brendan, and to you also for joining us this evening, all the viewers. And I really hope that you will listen to the tours. As I said at the beginning, the first is released this Saturday at 3 o'clock French time on the Centre Culturel website. I've posted the link in the chat, and you can also sign up for reminders, and we'll be releasing the walks then every Saturday afternoon. So you'll know now what to do with your Saturday afternoons. And thanks once again to everybody for joining us. Thank you to the artists, and you know, huge congratulations as well to you for these wonderful wonderful creations. I'm very proud for them to enter the archive of Centre Culturel Irlandais commissions. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.